The simmering tension between the administrations of President Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu apparently boiled over today. Biden says he warned behind closed doors that Netanyahu risks losing support across the world if the Israeli military does not change course on its, and I quote him here, indiscriminate bombing in Gaza. It's a sentiment he echoed in slightly softer language in front of cameras a few hours ago.
We have made it clear to the Israelis, and are aware, that the safety of innocent Palestinians is still of great concern. And so the actions they're taking must be consistent with attempting to do everything possible to prevent innocent Palestinian civilians from being hurt, murdered, killed.
One of the other big sources of tension between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu is the question of what will happen in Gaza after the war. The White House is pushing for the Palestinian Authority, that's currently the governing regime in the West Bank, to take over Gaza. Netanyahu says it is a non-starter. It's worth remembering Netanyahu has facilitated the payment of millions of dollars to Hamas in Gaza to prop it up as something of a competitor to the Palestinian Authority in order to make the prospect of a two-state solution with a unified Palestinian regime less likely. Now, this comes as the dire humanitarian crisis in Gaza gets ever more perilous under sustained airstrikes and shelling from the Israeli military. According to an analysis from the Financial Times, a larger percentage of buildings have been damaged in northern Gaza, where the campaign started, over the past 2 months than in the entire Allied bombing campaign of Dresden in Germany during World War II, legendary as one of the most intense bombing campaigns of the war. And practically every single NGO and aid organization is shouting at the absolute top of their lungs about the scale of mass death and horror in Gaza. Leaders from many of those groups co-authored a new essay in the New York Times titled, "We are no strangers to human suffering, but we've seen nothing like the siege of Gaza." Yanti Saripto is a co-author of that essay. She's president and CEO of Save the Children, which has provided aid to Palestinian children for 7 decades. Peter Beinart is author of the Beinart Notebook on Substack and contributor to another piece in the Times today about a path to peace in Gaza, and they both join me now. Let me start with you on this essay. And it has been a challenge, I think. I want to read from it. You say, most of our organizations have been operating in Gaza for decades. We can do nothing remotely adequate to address the level of suffering without an immediate and complete ceasefire and an end to the siege. The aerial bombardments have rendered our jobs impossible. The withholding of water, fuel, food, and other basic goods has created an enormous scale of need that aid alone cannot offset. We get images of places in dire humanitarian straits a lot in the world. There are several hotspots right now, including in Sudan and other places. As an aid organization that has experience in this, I've been struck by Doctors Without Borders and others who say there is something particularly acute here. Why?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. A couple of things. And as you said, Save the Children has been doing humanitarian work for over 100 years in all these hotspots and is doing so today, from Sudan to Afghanistan to Ethiopia and anywhere else. What is unique here? It is a very small piece of land, an ever decreasing piece of land with 2 million people, 1 million of whom are children. And there is no way to escape. In many of the other crises that we are present, not everybody can always get out, not everybody can flee, but a lot can. Here it is completely impossible. There's also a complete withholding of basic necessities. Water, fuel, electricity, food, also in the places where there is no fighting. So there is no water. We're looking at, yes, children are dying from bombing and shelling and violence. Many more will die from waterborne diseases, from hunger, if this doesn't stop.
The comments by Joe Biden behind closed doors, where he used that word indiscriminate, which has been a real sort of third rail thing to say, I think. One of the weird paradoxes here always is that the Biden administration has wrapped itself very closely to Netanyahu, who is wildly unpopular in Israel, and also just has a different worldview and set of politics and values than Joe Biden does. And it feels to me like there's only so long that tension's going to be brooked.
Right, but listening to Joe Biden, I think is kind of surreal. I mean, he says international support is eroding. He's not just a political commentator like me.
Correct.
He's the president of the United States. The question is, if you, Joe Biden, believe it's indiscriminate, why are you sending more weapons with no restrictions on what the weapons can do? It doesn't make any sense. If you, the question,
Right, to put it on some other...
To put it on somebody else, like some other guy is going to make the decision. You have to make the decision. Your legacy is going to be American complicity in this historic slaughter and a destruction of the very liberal international norms that you have staked your presidency on.
Let me ask you something about the NGO community, because I've heard this critique and I'd like you to respond to it. It basically goes the following way. All these NGOs are doing important and good work in Gaza, and there's a lot of them because it's because of the weird situation that it finds itself in with, it doesn't have normal trade, it doesn't have, but because of the fact that they are basically dependent on Hamas, which is the governing authority there, and Hamas doesn't like dissent, and that everyone sort of has to kind of accommodate them, and that the NGOs aren't going to say anything bad about them, and they're not going to criticize Hamas, so that they can operate and do the humanitarian work, but it means that groups like yours aren't really sort of like fair dealers or neutral arbiters in this.
Yeah, we get that a lot, we and others. And look, we work in super complicated crises like this one, but it's not the only one, where you have that tension between the importance of access, the importance of safety and security for our staff on the ground, who we do not want to put a target on their back, as well as sticking to our humanitarian principles: neutrality, impartiality, independence, humanity. And that's sometimes the dancing of the head of a pin, and that's why, yes, we do private advocacy, we sometimes speak out publicly, sometimes with others, sometimes alone. So those are the constant judgments we're making. We've been very clear from the onset in this particular crisis. We abhor the events of October 7th. Hostages should be released immediately. It's great that some were released, but clearly there are still hostages left. They need to be released unconditionally, of course. So all parties here are absolutely guilty of fighting this, of ensuring now that children in Gaza have no future. All parties, and they need to stop.
The end of that pause, which was the only good news that we've had since everything. I mean, we got to see hostages released, right? I mean, it was an amazing image. I mean, the woman Yarden, Roman, whose brother was sitting at this table, she's back with the family for Hanukkah. It's like that fell apart, and there's different accounts of why. But it doesn't seem that it does seem like Hamas wants the fighting to go on. That they pulled off this audacious atrocity because they want the war. When people say, well, there should be a ceasefire, like it takes two to tango, like can you do a ceasefire if one side wants to keep warring?
Well, a ceasefire by its nature has to be both sides. Hamas has to stop its rockets. I think I understand the impulse by Israel, absolutely, of course, to destroy Hamas because of the horrors of what it did. But again, and you've made this point again and again, which is really important, one of the lessons that America learned after 9/11 is you should not depose a government unless you have an idea of what's going to come afterwards. Otherwise, you own it and you are trapped in an insurgency.
And no one seems, I mean, when you think about the work of Save the Children in Gaza the day after, what does that even mean?
Everybody talks about a day after. We are asked about what would you do about it the day after. We're like, we've got our 10-point plan. This is what we would do in a crisis like this. But as it is today, there is no day after.
What does that mean?
There is no infrastructure left. There is, less than a third of the hospitals are even remotely operational. Half of the homes are destroyed. That number is probably old by now. Almost none of the schools are undamaged or completely destroyed. There is no infrastructure. There is no water infrastructure. There are no roads. People are putting tents up in the middle of the road, which again hampers people being able to flee anywhere. So that's the hardware infrastructure question. But there is also almost no hope left like this. What do you put on that generation of children that are witnessing this level of trauma and destruction and death?
Yanti Sarifto and Peter Beinart, thank you both. Appreciate it.